I'm Cynthia Rowland, and this is episode 115 of EO Radio Show. This is our 19th in a series of quick tip episodes focusing on the details of state registration of nonprofit corporations. In previous episodes, we talked about filing in Delaware and California, which are the most frequently used by our clients, most of whom have a connection with California. Other episodes have focused on the state filings in Nevada and Arizona, Washington State and Oregon, Alaska and Hawaii, New York and New Jersey, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Maine and Vermont, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Florida and Louisiana, North and South Carolina, Kentucky, Tennessee, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico and Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, Washington, D.C., Michigan, Ohio, Illinois and Indiana, and last month, Wisconsin and Minnesota. With the help of Joe Hilliard, today we look at the basic state filing requirements for nonprofit corporations operating in South Dakota and North Dakota. You can find all the prior episodes on our website or at the Farella YouTube channel, where there's a playlist just for state filing requirements. We'll work our way through the rest of the states in future episodes. Welcome to the EO Radio Show, your nonprofit legal resource. Brought to you by the Exempt Organizations Group at Farella, Braun & Martel. My name is Cynthia Rowland, and I'm a partner at Farella. I'm a business and tax lawyer with more than 30 years of experience advising clients on nonprofit and charity law. Through this podcast, our lawyers and guests will discuss a range of legal and business issues impacting the nonprofit world, because we understand you work hard every day to make your community a better place to live and do business. Many of our programs focus on the basics, and at times we'll do a deep dive into narrow and complicated legal issues. Again, welcome to the EO Radio Show. We're glad you're here. As we discussed in previous episodes, nonprofit corporations are one variety of fictitious business entities. Others include partnerships and limited liability companies. The laws of all the states prescribe certain formalities that organizers of these business entities must go through so that the entity can be registered and subject to legal process as if it were a person. Since business enterprises aren't natural persons, the laws have developed mechanisms for treating them like people. This is where the state filings come into play. In order for the organizers of these fictitious entities to take advantage of the protection of the laws, they have to provide notice as to the legal name, the state whose jurisdiction they are claiming for corporate governance laws, a physical address where they can be served with legal process, and certain other information that varies state to state. In this episode, we aren't going to dive deep into the pros and cons for where to incorporate, but instead we're focusing on the ease of formation, standardized documents that are available, filing fees, and similar matters. As with all the states we have discussed, if you do business as a nonprofit in South Dakota or North Dakota, or solicit charitable contributions there, even if just through the nonprofit corporation's website, your organization may need to have a legal presence and be registered in those two states. For the details on North Dakota and South Dakota, I'm happy to welcome back Joe Hilliard. Joe is a senior paralegal at Farella. He specializes in formation and compliance matters for all manner of entities, and in particular charities that are tax exempt under Internal Revenue Code Section 501c3. Prior to working at Farella, he worked in-house for several real estate development and management companies in Southern California, working on real estate purchases and vendor contracting. Welcome back, Joe.
Hey, good to be back.
So as we've been doing recently, let's start with our public service announcement, updates on other state laws. Anything to report there?
Well, we have a raise in price, which seems not unusual in 2025 for pretty much anything. But in Maryland, the expedite fees are now $325 for a rush on their online. And for a 2-hour, it's actually now $425. So that's a lot more. So think about that. I think that was almost $150 more per from when we looked at that just about this time last year when we did Maryland. So as always, check your costs when you're starting to register and file things.
All right. So back to our regularly scheduled program. Let's start with South Dakota. How do we create a new nonprofit corporation in South Dakota?
In South Dakota, the Secretary of State governs the entity formation. This is something we see in most states. For the domestic nonprofits, they have a 4-page form, Articles of Incorporation, Domestic Nonprofit Corporation. Their nonprofit onboarding page, which is in the links, has both an online and a paper filing availability on the same page. It's unusual, but it's really nice because it allows for a much easier formation. You can follow along real easily. As always, while this asks for a lot of the basics, the name you want to use, your address in the state, your registered agent, let's go step by step some of the unique items in this form. They use Roman numerals. We'll go through this. They use Roman numerals for their sections in the domestic and non-Roman numerals for the foreign. So it's kind of reversed. So this is Article Roman numeral 1A. It's the purpose of the nonprofit. We've talked about that. This is very good to have in. Article 2 is a checkbox for whether it's perpetual or if it will have a finite date. Article 3 is a checkbox for members. It's a yes or no checkbox. Article 5 is for identification of the registered agent. It allows for 3 different options here to have an individual, a commercial registered agent, which is obviously what we usually recommend, or an officer of the entity. This dovetails into our conversation last time when we talked about Wisconsin, where it noted the company itself could not be its own agent. This is exactly that scenario we were talking about, where you could have an officer be that person of register. I know we've talked about this when I worked in-house for at least one of a smaller corporations they put my name as the registered agent to be delivered. So when things came, when they were served, they go to the front desk and ask for me personally. And that's what you would do then here. So it wouldn't necessarily be an officer, but someone at the company could be that registered agent. Article 6 is the name and address of the incorporator. Interestingly, here, this can be an entity. It's not something we've really seen in a review. Usually it has to be an individual that's the incorporator. Article 7 asks for the name and address of all the directors. Under SDCL, that'd be the South Dakota corporate law, 47-23-14. This has to be at least 3 for the directors, which is not uncommon. We've talked about that before with some of the other states. Article 8 is for nonprofits with members only, where we can further delineate classes of members. Article 9 is also unique. It notes that if the directors are not elected or appointed by members, then you must spell out how they are elected or appointed. This could be mimicked by what you have in your bylaws language and would potentially need to include a discussion of designated directors. Again, very unusual. Article 10 is for the provisions to elect, including, quote, any provision for the distribution of assets on dissolution or final liquidation, unquote. This is where we would include our internal revenue 501c3 language for the dissolutions. And then the final page is a signature page, and it needs to be an authorized officer that signs off here. So that's unusual. Usually we can just, as you and I know, Cynthia, sometimes we just have someone just sign off as the incorporator and then do a background of that incorporator moving things to the directors and the officers. But here it has to be someone that will be an officer that signs off on it.
Yeah, so this is really interesting. And I just want to note that these requirements for describing how directors are elected, a lot of times in my experience, organizations never go back and look at their articles when they're fussing with their bylaws and their director selection provisions. So I guess in South Dakota, this is a little bit of a trap for the unwary. If you have complicated director selection provisions that are stated in the articles, you probably want to be sure that your bylaws direct everybody to go back and look at the articles if they want to make an amendment to the director selection provisions. Let's move on to foreign registration. So we've got a non-South Dakota entity that wants to qualify to do business in South Dakota. How do they register?
South Dakota has a non-stock application for certificate of authority for a foreign nonprofit corporation. It's 2 pages. It's very straightforward and same a lot of our basics: name, where they were formed, their address, a South Dakota registered agent. Section 5 will ask if the corporation has perpetual existence in its home state. Same caveats on the registered agent as we just discussed, where you can have a variety of choices. Section 7 is for the purpose of the corporation. Section 8 asks for all principal officers and directors and a street address for them. The list includes not just president, secretary, treasurer, our normals, but also a vice president. And it says all vice presidents, actually. We'll discuss that again when we get to their annual reports. And yes, a current home state certificate of status must be included with this filing.
All right. So that's not real surprising. Nothing real surprising in there. So what's the cost in South Dakota?
So for the domestic, it's $30, and for the foreign, it's $125.
Okay. And how quickly can we get those details done?
Per the South Dakota's website, quote, on average, new paper filings are processed within 3 to 5 business days. Online filings are processed immediately, unquote. And then for your paper filing, there is a $50 expedite available as well. So that's very rapid. That's comparable to Delaware, which obviously that's what they run through things. That's kind of what we're seeing here in California, at least here in 2025. So it comes and goes.
Yeah, but it sounds like the online is pretty smooth and easy. So
yes, for sure.
Going to look at that as a first option. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about annual filings and the annual fees for our entities that are in South Dakota.
For sure. So in South Dakota, annual reports are due every year on the first day of the anniversary month of when the business is filed. So if we form today, it's March 5th, 2025. Our report will be due by March 1st every year going forward. So starting March 1st, 2026. Unlike a lot of states, there's a separate form for domestic and foreign. For the domestic annual report, you need to give the name and business address of all the directors and principal officers. South Dakota further notes for principal officers at minimum will be a president, vice president, secretary, and treasury, which we kind of noted when we were talking about the formations. And again, we don't normally see vice presidents as mandatory. There's also some interesting quirks. You need to answer yes or no to whether the nonprofit owns agricultural land under SDCL 43-2A1 and whether there is a non-U.S. beneficial owner. So it's something to think about. I mean, I know some of our foundations do have ranches, so it would be something to think about if you're in South Dakota. Further, it has an option to name all the beneficial owners, which it defines as, quote, a person who has or in some manner controls an equity security. This is an optional.
And very unusual for a nonprofit because nonprofit corporations don't generally have
No, I know.
beneficial owners. Yeah, and it's making me think of the Corporate Transparency Act, and the states are going to step into that fray. But anyway, I digress. Odd little quirk there.
Yeah, then the foreign annual report has the sections on officers and directors worded slightly differently, and it does not include the vice president mandate. And then both these forms will be in the show links.
Okay, great.
The annual fees are $10 irrespective of whether you're domestic or foreign there.
Wow, I think that's the lowest we've seen.
Yeah. Because even when we discussed it, Colorado went up from 10 to 25 at the end of last year. That was the only other cheaper one I had seen lately.
Yeah. So transparency, I guess it is pretty transparent in South Dakota.
Yeah.
There's a lot of information.
As we noted back there, the initial domestic formation names the directors, and then in the foreign registration, the officers and directors. And then once you got to the annual reports, all the officers and directors would be named. And again, keeping in mind that especially for your domestic ones, you have vice presidents that need to be named too. So that's really a higher transparency than we see in most states in terms of officers, for sure.
All right. So what about other state agencies? Does South Dakota police the nonprofit organizations?
Actually, unlike most states, South Dakota, there's no licensing or registration requirements for nonprofit or charitable organizations. Also, they don't require charitable organizations who conduct just via direct mail to register. Paid solicitors, however, are required to be registered and bonded with their attorney general's office. We don't really talk about the paid solicitors that much, but certainly if you're using one, you should look into that. They're also required to provide solicitation campaign notices and financial reports to the Division of Consumer Protection there for the Attorney General. So they have a double prompt. And then for tax exemptions, the Department of Revenue governs that. I have a link to the fact for both the Department of Revenue and all these other websites in the show notes.
Okay, great. So that's our overview of South Dakota. Now moving to their neighbor right to the north, how does North Dakota approach the formation of nonprofit organizations?
So North Dakota, we also have our Secretary of State governing things. Their on-site portal uses the same interface portal model that we've seen for California and Idaho. So if you're familiar with either of those, you won't be surprised to see it, how it looks, or to realize you need to set up an account to navigate the forms, to even look at them. And unlike California, they're only available as onlines. There's no PDFs that you can print and download and then file in. Much like their southern brethren, they too have a name for their website portal. It's First Stop. So just as like we saw BizFile when we were in Florida, here going all the way up to the north, we have First Stop. And all of the online form is recommended here. If you do wish to file articles that contain additional provisions not required in state laws, they accept self-drafted articles delivered to the office there at the Secretary of State. This is, again, what we do in California. The online form will only support provisions that are required in state law. So this goes back to our 501c3 language that we like. So yes, like California, we would recommend incorporating by having a Word document drafted, approved, signed off that way. The Secretary of State website does offer a great domestic nonprofit guidebook, which I've linked in there. Crucially, nonprofit articles must contain the following: a statement that the corporation is incorporated under NDCC Chapter 1033-2, the name, obviously, address of the principal executive office. That's the office where the elected or appointed president has an office, or if the corporation has no elected president, then the registered office of the corporation. So that's kind of interesting. Their commercial registered agent and their address, a designation, whether it's going to be in the future now. Again, we see the purpose, names and addresses of the incorporators, and then, again, any other provisions deemed necessary. This is where we would put in our 501c3 tax exemption language. And then also, if the corporation chooses to determine a specific date on which it is to cease to exist, this date may also be included. I know we don't talk about that often either. I know you and I have seen some older foundations where we've had that come into play, but It doesn't seem very common that we have a non-perpetual foundation, but if you want to.
Yeah, that is pretty unusual. Just backing up to the address a little bit here. The filing itself requires an address. I guess this isn't that unusual. It's either the principal office where an officer is or the registered agent where a person actually is.
Or a person is.
Yeah, the point being that that can't be a P.O. box, I guess is what I was trying to get at.
Yeah, no, it does have to have a street address of some sort, yes.
Yeah, so in this work from home era, this is why it caught my attention, where a lot of times these nonprofits are out of somebody's home. You're almost certainly going to want to use a registered agent then, because we really don't like to put home offices on this kind of a document. So anyway, I digress a little bit. Just wanted to point that out.
For sure. Like all the other states we've looked at in common practice, nonprofits are not required to file their bylaws with the Secretary of State. However, here they give you the option to file your bylaws. You may do so. Any bylaws filed with the Secretary of State will then obviously be available to the public, and there's a filing fee of $10 and then $10 for each amendment. And it's right on their website. You can just hit the button and it will let you file your bylaws. I don't know if I would recommend that, but
yeah. I mean, and my hesitation on that, and I guess it's probably because I've been doing a lot of bylaw amendments lately. Many nonprofits amend their bylaws with great frequency. And if you're not aware that they're filed online, it's pretty easy to forget to update the state. In California, when we change bylaws, we always tell the IRS, the Franchise Tax Board, and our AG's office, but not the Secretary of State.
No,
so that's a little unusual. Word to the wise there. If you're messing with your bylaws, check your incorporation rules and make sure that you've included the update every place it needs to go. That's bylaws. Anything else interesting about North Dakota?
Interestingly, yes, North Dakota also has the option to form a nonprofit limited liability company. I mean, the Articles of Organization here is also an online form in their First Stop portal. As with the corporate filing, the online form is recommended, but if you want to file additional provisions like this, the 501c3, you could do that. I don't know. I mean, you and I were kind of discussing this offline. It's an odd choice, and we don't very often see nonprofit LLCs.
Yeah, it is really unusual. I think the attraction to an LLC is the usually very customizable operating agreement. You don't have to follow corporate structure in an LLC. But with that being said, if a 501c3, an entity that intends to be classified as a public charity, is thinking about using a nonprofit limited liability company form of organization, there are definitely some hoops to think about, because it's not going to be as turnkey as using a nonprofit corporation. You know, it's interesting to see that this is an option in North Dakota.
Okay. And then lastly, for our foreign nonprofits, there's a foreign nonprofit corporation certificate of application that can be filed. As with domestic, there is an option to register a foreign nonprofit LLC as well. I was unable to access a PDF version of this application, nor does the website really indicate whether you need a good standing certificate from your home state. In the sense that the North Dakota Secretary of State website was very frustrating. It took a lot longer to go through this and parse through things than it normally does when we talk about these things. So be aware as you're registering in North Dakota, you're going to have some opaque and mind-numbing issues as you try to form your stuff. Again, I would recommend going back to the Secretary of State's nonprofit guide, which has a nice overview, even though it doesn't have the forms per se, but it gives you a broader overview before you get this far.
That's good advice.
Yeah.
Processing times and fees for North Dakota.
Unlike South Dakota, North Dakota's website did not list any business processing times, but I checked out with some of our outside services, and the average is 5 business days for online filings and a 2 to 3 week for mailed in. And they do not have an expedite process. That's
pretty slow on both fronts compared to what we're seeing in a lot of the states.
And then the domestic articles are $40 and the foreign certificate is $50 to file.
All right, so let's wrap up a little bit with the annual filings and the fees for that, and then some transparency questions.
For sure. So all nonprofit corporations must file an annual report with the Secretary of State on or before February 1st of each year. The first filing report is due the year following the calendar year of the formation. So if we form now in March of 2025, our first annual report would be due February 1st, 2026. Again, the annual reports include their name, their registered agent, principal office that they're using, a statement of the character of the activities in which the corporation is engaged in, and their federal tax code by which tax exemption is established. So a little bit different. And then names and addresses of the officers and directors. It's the same form for both foreign and domestic. It's $10 for that also. And then if you're late, you automatically have an additional $5 fee. So if you file February 2nd, it's $15, which is still not unreasonable.
Still pretty inexpensive, yeah.
And we just talked about that there at the end of that with the annual report. Officers and directors and an address for them need to be named. And we talked about that too, in terms of like where we were needed to register with the front too. So again, it's fairly transparent here in terms of who's in charge.
And that address, the addresses there are street addresses or P.O. box?
It does have to be a street address, yes.
Great. So wrapping up North Dakota, the state oversight, are there any agencies that review North Dakota nonprofit organizations?
So here in North Dakota, everything is run through the Secretary of State. So if you're organized there in North Dakota or a foreign nonprofit soliciting, holding assets, you have an additional charitable organization registration statement that you file, and then an additional annual report that's due separately. And that includes like your financials and the normal things we see that would go through an AG. But here, both things go through all of it's run through the Secretary of State. And then they have a Office of State Tax Commissioner, and that governs all the tax exemptions. I've put in some links on their sales and use tax exemptions in the file, in the notes, as well as links to everything we've talked about. Are those
North Dakota annual reports for the charitable organization, are those made available on a public site?
That was my understanding. Yes. Again, it was kind of opaque, but yes, it looked like you could. I did not set up, we just talked about that, having to set up an account to look at things. I didn't set up an actual account with the state at this time, but yes, it appeared that from reading the descriptions, yes, they are publicly available. Again, it's comparable again to what we see here in California with the RRF1, where you've got, this is my stuff, and then you attach the 990 to it that makes it publicly available. So here it's got the financials and it attaches that. So you would still be publicly available. Yes.
Interesting. Okay. Well, thanks, Joe, for covering 2 more states. I think we're somewhat in our final stretch. We're more than halfway there at this point. So we'll continue with a couple of other states in about a month. Thanks for helping me with this one.
For sure. I appreciate being on as always.
So that's all for this episode. Be sure to check out the show notes for all the links that Joe mentioned for the resources in the Dakotas and links to our earlier episodes on the states we've already covered. Also, as a reminder, if you go back to earlier episodes for the states we've already covered, be sure to check into updated laws before looking at filing or even doing your annual report in any state. So be sure that you're looking at the current versions of the links that we note in all of those. As I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, we have a YouTube channel, and there are several nonprofit playlists, including this one that we're building, where all the state filing episodes are in one place, so you can skim through that to find the link to the state that you are particularly interested in. So with that, I'm Cynthia Rowland, and you've been listening to EO Radio Show, your nonprofit legal resource, brought to you by the Exempt Organizations Group at Farella, Braun, and Martel. If you have suggestions for topics you would like for us to discuss, please email us at eoradioshow@fbm.com. That's eoradioshow@fbm.com. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, make a difference.